A new beginning, an unexpected encounter. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the city, illuminating its vibrant streets and towering buildings. Marcia Wilson adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the city skyline as it slowly melted into the horizon. It had been exactly 1 month since she'd been sworn in as the new chief of police for the city's 8th precinct. The significance of her position was not lost on her. She was the first black woman to hold the title in the city's long history. She knew that her appointment was more than just a personal achievement. It was a testament to progress and a symbol of hope for so many people who had waited for a change in leadership. Marcia's journey to this point had been anything but easy. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, she'd witnessed firsthand the struggles her community faced. Her father, a dedicated activist and civil rights advocate, had instilled in her the values of fairness, resilience, and a commitment to justice. Marcia had watched him fight tirelessly for equality, often standing on the front lines of protests and community meetings, demanding accountability and respect for marginalized people. She admired his strength and unwavering determination, and from a young age, she'd known that she wanted to follow in his footsteps, not as an activist, but as someone who could enact change from within the system. After graduating at the top of her class from the police academy, Marcia faced an uphill battle. As a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated force, she was often overlooked, underestimated, and at times, blatantly disrespected. But rather than let it deter her, Marcia used every slight as fuel to push harder. She excelled in every role she held, from patrol officer to detective, proving herself time and again through her dedication, skill, and integrity. Slowly, she climbed the ranks, breaking through barriers and shattering stereotypes, until she stood at the pinnacle of her career, chief of police. Now, as she drove through the familiar streets of her city, Marcia couldn't help but reflect on the responsibility that weighed on her shoulders. She'd inherited a precinct with a checkered past, one plagued by allegations of misconduct and strained relations with minority communities. Her goal was clear: to reform the precinct, to build trust, and to ensure that her officers upheld the values of fairness and respect. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. Change never was. Lost in thought, Marcia was pulled back to the present by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser, sirens blaring, sped up behind her. Confused, she glanced at her speedometer. She was well within the speed limit. There was no reason for her to be stopped. A slight frown creased her brow as she pulled over to the side of the road, her mind racing with questions. Was this a mistake? A routine traffic stop? As the cruiser came to a halt behind her, Marcia watched in her side mirror as 2 officers exited the vehicle. They were both white men, tall and muscular, their strides slow and deliberate, exuding the sense of authority. Marcia couldn't help but notice their demeanor, the exaggerated swagger, the sharp gaze scanning the surroundings. It was the kind of attitude she'd seen countless times in her career, especially when officers wanted to assert dominance. She knew that look all too well. The taller of the 2, Officer Stevens, approached her window while his partner, Officer Harris, stood slightly behind, arms crossed over his chest. Marcia rolled down her window, her expression calm but alert. She'd been on the other side of these encounters many times, both as an officer and as a black woman in America. She knew the protocol, but she also knew that this situation had the potential to escalate, depending on how these officers chose to handle it. "License and registration, ma'am," Officer Stevens said, his tone firm and slightly dismissive, as though he was already convinced of her guilt. Marcia handed over her documents without a word, her silence a quiet assertion of her own authority. She didn't feel the need to explain herself. After all, she hadn't done anything wrong. But there was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a subtle strength that only those who knew her well could recognize. Stevens glanced over her license, his eyes flickering briefly to her face before looking back at the document. "What are you doing in this part of town?" he asked, his tone laced with a thinly veiled suspicion. Marcia felt a pang of irritation, but kept her voice steady. "I live around here," she replied, offering no further explanation. She could sense the underlying racism in his question, the assumption that her mere presence in this neighborhood warranted suspicion. It wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a probe, a subtle challenge to her right to be there. Officer Harris, the quieter one, stepped forward, his gaze cold and appraising. "Ma'am, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. We need to know what you're doing here at this time," he said, his voice lacking any hint of warmth or friendliness. Marcia clenched her jaw, recognizing the familiar tactic, intimidation and control, veiled under the guise of procedure. She'd seen officers use this approach countless times, especially on individuals who looked like her. But she also knew that this was a pivotal moment, a test of her patience and her principles. She could have ended the exchange instantly by revealing her identity as their superior, but something within her urged her to let the situation play out. "I was on my way home," she replied calmly, meeting their gaze without flinching. Her tone was even, but there was a steely resolve beneath her words, a quiet defiance that neither officer seemed to notice. Stevens seemed to grow more agitated, his authority challenged by her calm demeanor. He leaned closer to her window, his face inches from hers, his voice dropping to a hard edge. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, Mom." For a moment, Marcia considered her options. She could comply, allow this charade to continue, or she could put an end to it right here, right now. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Two officers so certain of their authority, so unaware that the woman they were attempting to intimidate was, in fact, their new boss. But Marcia wasn't ready to play that card just yet. Instead, she looked directly at Officer Stevens, her gaze unwavering. "Officer," she said, her voice firm and laced with an unspoken warning, "do you know who I am?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For the first time, Marcia saw a flicker of uncertainty in Stevens's eyes. He glanced at Harris, a silent exchange passing between them, their confidence shaken by her question. They hadn't anticipated this, a challenge to their authority from someone who clearly wasn't intimidated. "Should I know?" Stevens replied, his tone faltering ever so slightly, as though he was beginning to realize that this wasn't the encounter he'd assumed it to be. Marcia allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say you're going to want to reconsider how you proceed from here," she said, her words measured and deliberate, each one landing with the weight of her position. Officer Harris shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the situation was slipping out of their control. "Ma'am, we're just following procedure here," he said, his tone less assured than before. Marcia straightened in her seat, her eyes flashing with a hint of fire. "Is that so?" she replied, her voice carrying a quiet authority that neither officer could ignore. "Because as far as I'm aware, I'm supposed to be briefed on any incidents involving my officers, and I don't recall authorizing this stop." The silence that followed was deafening, a tense pause as both officers processed her words. Marcia watched them closely, noting the shift in their expressions, the realization dawning on their faces as the truth sank in. They had pulled over their own chief of police, the woman who held more power than either of them could imagine. Stevens's face paled, his confidence evaporating in an instant. He cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. "Chief of police. You're our new chief," he stammered, disbelief coloring his tone. Marcia's gaze remained steady, unyielding. "That's exactly what I'm saying," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "And I'm beginning to think this stop wasn't about any suspicious activity, was it?" Neither officer responded, their silence a damning admission. The authority they had wielded so confidently only moments before had crumbled in the face of her revelation, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Marcia took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She knew that this encounter was about more than just these two officers. It was about the entire culture she had vowed to change, a culture that allowed this kind of profiling and abuse of power to persist. She wouldn't let this moment pass without making her stance clear. "I've spent my career fighting for justice," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I won't tolerate officers under my command harassing citizens because of the color of their skin or the way they look. This precinct is going to change, starting with the way you treat the people you're supposed to serve." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick and unyielding. Both officers seemed to shrink under her gaze, their arrogance melting away in the face of her quiet fury. After a long pause, Harris finally looked down, shame evident on his face. "Chief Wilson, we didn't know. We had no idea it was you." Marcia's gaze softened, but only slightly. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't know it was me, but that didn't stop you from assuming the worst, and that's exactly why things need to change." As she spoke, Marcia felt a surge of determination rise within her. This was her moment, her chance to set the tone for her leadership, to make it clear that she would not tolerate the old ways of doing things. She was here to create a precinct where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. No exceptions. And with that, Marcia closed her car window, leaving the two officers standing in stunned silence as she drove away. Knowing that this was only the beginning of the transformation she was determined to bring. Setting the tone, Marcia couldn't shake the encounter as she drove the rest of the way home. The arrogance, the entitlement, the casual presumption of guilt based on her appearance, all of it was a reminder of why she had fought so hard to reach this position. She felt a mixture of anger and sadness, despite all the progress society claimed to have made. Moments like these reminded her that some things were still deeply ingrained. As she parked in her driveway and stepped out of the car, Marcia took a deep breath, centering herself. The evening was quiet, the air cool, and the sky painted in shades of purple and orange as the sun sank lower. Her home was her sanctuary, a modest but cozy place where she could unwind from the pressures of her job. But tonight, even the calming atmosphere of her home couldn't fully settle her mind. Inside, she found her teenage daughter, Talia, seated at the kitchen table, her books spread out in front of her. Talia looked up as Marcia entered, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hey, Mom. How was work?" Marcia forced a smile, hiding the weight of the evening's events. "It was a day," she replied, ruffling her daughter's hair as she passed by. Talia tilted her head, her smile fading slightly. "You okay?" Marcia paused, contemplating how much she should share. Talia was perceptive, and Marcia never wanted to hide the truth from her. She knew that her daughter, growing up as a black girl in a world filled with implicit bias, would need to understand the realities of life. But Marcia also wanted to shield her from the harsher aspects of her work, at least for a little while longer. "I had a reminder today of why I do what I do," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "Sometimes people forget that respect isn't something you only show to certain people. It should be for everyone. That's part of what I'm trying to change." Talia nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Well, I know you'll make it better. You're strong, Mom. You can handle anything." Marcia smiled, feeling the surge of pride and strength from her daughter's words. Talia was her anchor, her reason for striving to create a better world. She knew that every battle she fought was not only for herself, but also for the young people who would inherit this society. After a quick dinner and a quiet evening spent with Talia, Marcia retreated to her study. She needed to think, to plan. It was clear that the precinct she now led was in desperate need of reform, and she was determined to make it happen, starting the very next morning. The following day, Marcia arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, her mind sharp and focused. As she walked through the doors, she could feel the eyes of her officers on her. Some of them looked away quickly, others nodded in acknowledgement, but a few held her gaze, their expressions unreadable. She knew that her presence was both a curiosity and a challenge for many of them. A black woman in charge, especially one as unflinchingly committed to change as Marcia was, wasn't something they were accustomed to. She made her way to her office, but instead of sitting behind her desk, she pulled a stack of files and made her way to the briefing room. She had decided to meet with her officers in a space where rank and authority felt less rigid. Today, she wanted an honest discussion, and she knew that wasn't going to happen with her sitting behind a desk, separated by status. Word spread quickly that the new chief was calling an unscheduled meeting, and soon the room was filled with officers, some curious, some apprehensive, and a few visibly resistant. Marcia scanned the room, recognizing Officer Stevens and Officer Harris standing near the back. She made a mental note of their expressions, the slight frowns on their faces, and the defensive body language. She knew she'd have to address their attitudes, but for now, she had a message for everyone. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "I know my arrival here as your new chief has stirred up some conversations, and I want to address a few things directly. I didn't come here just to fill a position. I came here to bring about change. Real change. And I'm well aware that change isn't always easy, but it's necessary." She paused, letting her words sink in. She could see the ripple of tension and curiosity move through the room. She took a deep breath, remembering the encounter from the previous night, and let that moment fuel her. "Yesterday, I had an experience that reminded me of the work we still need to do," she continued, her tone sharpening. "I was pulled over by two of our own officers while driving home. I was questioned, suspected, and treated in a way that I believe was influenced more by my appearance than by any legitimate reason." A murmur spread through the room, and she saw several officers glance at each other. Stevens and Harris shifted uncomfortably, their faces paling as they realized where this conversation was heading. Marcia held up a hand, silencing the room. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," she said firmly, "but I am here to hold everyone accountable, including myself. This is the kind of behavior that damages trust with the communities we serve. It's the kind of behavior that creates division instead of unity, and it's the kind of behavior that I won't tolerate." She let the weight of her words linger, her gaze sweeping across the room, making eye contact with each officer she could. "I know that some of you may feel uncomfortable with this shift in leadership. Some of you may question my ability to lead or even my intentions. That's fine. You're entitled to your opinions. But what you're not entitled to is to undermine the mission of this precinct, which is to serve and protect every single citizen, without bias, without discrimination, and without abuse of power." A few heads nodded, and she noticed one of the veteran officers, Sergeant Lewis, step forward. He'd been with the force for nearly 30 years, a well-respected figure among the ranks. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice measured and respectful. "Chief Wilson," he began, "I think most of us understand that you're here to make things better. And I respect that. But, if I may ask, how do you intend to change things? We've been doing things a certain way for a long time, and not all of it is pretty, but that's how it's been. How do you expect us to shift overnight?" Marcia nodded, appreciating his honesty. She knew that real change would require more than just new policies. It would require a fundamental shift in mindset, something that couldn't happen overnight. But she also knew that in order to inspire this change, she had to be clear about her vision. "That's a fair question, Sergeant," she replied. "Change won't happen overnight, and I'm not expecting it to. But there are a few steps we can start taking right now. First, we're implementing mandatory training sessions focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. These sessions aren't just a formality. They're tools to help us see the world through the eyes of the people we serve." A few officers exchanged skeptical glances, but Marcia pressed on. "Secondly, we'll be increasing our community outreach. I want each and every one of you to get to know the neighborhoods you patrol. Attend community meetings, listen to their concerns, and understand their perspectives. This isn't about enforcing authority. It's about building trust." She looked around, reading the reactions in the room. Some were supportive, while others were wary. It was clear that not everyone was ready to embrace this new approach, but Marcia knew that persistence was key. "And lastly," she continued, "there will be accountability. I want to make it clear that actions have consequences. If anyone is found engaging in discriminatory practices, they will be held responsible. This isn't a threat. It's a promise. We're here to uphold the law, not to be above it." At this, Officer Stevens shifted again, his face tense. Marcia could tell that he was struggling with the idea of her leadership, but she also knew that she couldn't let resistance deter her. Sergeant Lewis nodded thoughtfully, his expression one of cautious optimism. "Chief, I appreciate your vision. And I think it's about time we started building those bridges with our community. But I also hope you understand that this is going to be a process. You're going to face pushback. Some of these guys, well, they'd been doing things a certain way for decades." Marcia smiled, grateful for his honesty. "Thank you, Sergeant. I do understand. And I'm not expecting instant change. But I am expecting commitment. I'm expecting everyone in this room to give their best effort, to uphold the values that we claim to stand for. I can't do this alone. I need all of you with me." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. Marcia could sense a shift, a small, almost imperceptible change in the air. She had planted a seed, and though it might take time, she was hopeful that it would eventually take root. After the meeting, as the officers filed out, a few of them stopped to offer her a nod of respect or a quiet word of support. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She could feel that some of them were willing to give her a chance, and that was all she needed to keep pushing forward. As she returned to her office, Marcia reflected on the journey ahead. She knew that transforming the precinct would be a monumental task, fraught with challenges and resistance. But she was ready. Her encounter with Stevens and Harris had only strengthened her resolve, reminding her of why she had taken this position in the first place. This was her moment to create a legacy, not just for herself, but for Talia, for her community, and for every officer who would come after her. And she was determined to make it one defined by respect, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice. Breaking down walls. The weeks following Marcia's initial meeting with her officers were filled with a whirlwind of initiatives, challenges, and tension. She knew that real change would take time and resilience. After the encounter with Stevens and Harris, she had seen firsthand the deeply rooted attitudes that plagued her precinct. But Marcia wasn't here to wage a war of words. She was here to transform a culture that had been left unchecked for far too long. As she settled into her office one chilly Monday morning, she glanced at the thick stack of files on her desk. Each one represented a complaint against her officers, a tapestry of unresolved grievances and mistrust that stretched back years. Racial profiling, unnecessary force, lack of accountability. The allegations varied, but the message was clear. The people didn't trust the very force meant to protect them. Marcia's first step was to address these complaints head-on. She didn't just file them away as previous chiefs had done. She personally reached out to the people who had submitted them. It was an unprecedented move, and one that raised more than a few eyebrows among her officers. Many wondered why she was giving so much attention to people they dismissed as troublemakers or agitators. But Marcia understood that for change to be real, it needed to start with acknowledging past mistakes. The phone calls were often difficult, sometimes painfully honest. She listened as people recounted experiences that had left lasting scars. The times they'd been pulled over without reason, the moments they'd been treated like suspects in their own neighborhoods. There were voices that quivered with anger, others that trembled with sadness, and a few that seemed resigned to a system they'd lost faith in long ago. One conversation, in particular, stayed with her. It was with an elderly black woman named Mrs. Johnson, who recounted an experience from 2 years prior. Her grandson, Jamal, had been stopped by police while walking home from basketball practice. The officers had questioned him aggressively, accusing him of trespassing, and eventually frisked him against the hood of their car. Jamal was only 14 at the time, and the incident had left him shaken, wary of law enforcement ever since. As Mrs. Johnson spoke, Marcia could feel the ache in her words. "Chief Wilson," she said quietly, "I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, and I've seen more than I care to remember. All I want is for my grandson to feel safe walking down his own street. That's all I want." Marcia promised her that things would change, that incidents like the one Jamal had endured would be a thing of the past. But even as she said the words, she felt the weight of her promise. She knew it wouldn't be easy to make good on it, but she was determined to try. The next phase of her plan involved the training session she had mentioned in her initial meeting. The precinct's officers were required to attend sessions on de-escalation tactics, implicit bias, and community engagement. She brought in specialists and trainers who were not only experts in their fields, but also people with lived experience in communities similar to the ones her officers patrolled. The first few sessions were met with visible resistance. Some officers rolled their eyes, slouched in their chairs, or sighed loudly whenever a trainer mentioned systemic bias or cultural competence. Marcia noticed that Stevens, in particular, seemed to challenge everything presented, often countering with arguments that seemed designed more to disrupt than engage. His skepticism was loud and often contagious, infecting others who were on the fence about her reforms. But Marcia remained calm and steady, refusing to be intimidated by the resistance. She understood that many of her officers felt threatened by the changes she was implementing. After all, these changes challenged their understanding of authority, their sense of identity, and the ways they had been trained to see the world. One afternoon, as the trainers led a session on implicit bias, Stevens raised his hand, his expression tight and annoyed. "With all due respect, Chief," he said, his voice edged with frustration, "aren't we overcomplicating things here? I mean, a lot of us have been on the force for years, and we know how to do our jobs. Why all this focus on bias and de-escalation? We're here to enforce the law, not cater to feelings." Marcia held his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "Officer Stevens, enforcing the law and respecting the people we serve are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they go hand in hand. We're here to protect everyone in this community, not just those who look like us or make us comfortable. And if we can't do that without making people feel like suspects in their own neighborhoods, then we're failing at our job." The room fell silent, her words cutting through the tension. She could see a few nods from officers who understood her message, who had seen firsthand the effects of unchecked bias and were ready for a new approach. But there were others who remained stony-faced, their arms crossed in defiance. After the session ended, Marcia noticed a young officer, Officer Patel, linger by the door, his face thoughtful. He approached her hesitantly, waiting until the others had left. "Chief Wilson," he began, his voice tentative, "I just wanted to say that I appreciate what you're doing. I know it's not easy, but I think it's important. My family moved here from India when I was a kid, and I remember feeling out of place, even scared sometimes. I joined the force because I wanted to make people feel safe, and I think these changes you're making will help us do that." Marcia felt a surge of gratitude and smiled warmly at him. "Thank you, Officer Patel. Your support means a lot. Change isn't easy, but it's people like you who make it possible." Their conversation renewed her resolve, reminding her that while there was resistance, there were also allies. She knew that the road ahead would be long, but moments like these gave her hope that change was within reach. As the weeks passed, Marcia's efforts began to bear fruit, albeit slowly. Some of her officers started to see the benefits of the new training, particularly in their interactions with the community. Reports of confrontations dropped slightly, replaced by more positive interactions. Officers who had previously been wary of engaging with residents now found themselves participating in neighborhood events, listening to concerns, and even mentoring local youth. One such event was a community barbecue organized by Marcia herself. She wanted to create a space where officers and residents could meet outside the formal constraints of policing, a place where they could see each other as people rather than as symbols of authority or mistrust. The event took place on a bright Saturday afternoon, with families gathered in a local park, the air filled with the smell of grilled food and the sounds of laughter. Marcia arrived early, helping set up tables and chairs alongside her officers. She was encouraged to see that a good number of them had shown up voluntarily, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to be there. She noticed Stevens hovering at the edge of the park, his face a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. She decided to approach him, sensing an opportunity to bridge the gap. "Glad you could make it, Officer Stevens," she said, offering a smile that was both warm and firm. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around. "Didn't have much else to do," he replied, his tone guarded. Marcia nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I know this is new for a lot of us," she said, her voice gentle but direct. "But I believe that events like this are essential. When people get to know us as individuals, it builds trust, and when we understand them, it makes our job easier. Wouldn't you agree?" Stevens looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Maybe. I still think a lot of this is unnecessary, but I get where you're coming from." "That's all I ask," Marcia replied, appreciating his honesty. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, and she was prepared to take small steps if it meant eventually winning over those who were skeptical. As the event progressed, Marcia moved through the crowd, chatting with families, shaking hands, and sharing stories. She saw her officers laughing with children, taking part in games, and connecting with the community in ways they hadn't before. She watched as Officer Patel played basketball with a group of teenagers, their laughter echoing across the park. She saw Officer Harris, usually quiet and reserved, helping an elderly woman with her plate, his demeanor softening in a way she hadn't seen before. The day was filled with moments that gave Marcia hope. For the first time, the officers and the community members weren't separated by titles or uniforms. They were simply people, sharing a meal, sharing stories, and building bridges. Toward the end of the event, Marcia was approached by Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had shared her grandson's story. She smiled warmly, reaching out to hold Marcia's hand. "Thank you, Chief Wilson," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "For the first time, I feel like we're being heard. My grandson's here today, and he hasn't stopped smiling since he got here. That's something I haven't seen in a long time." Marcia felt her throat tighten with emotion. She squeezed Mrs. Johnson's hand, feeling the strength in the older woman's grip. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. This is just the beginning. We have a long way to go, but I'm committed to making things right." As the event wound down and people began to leave, Marcia stood quietly, watching the officers help with cleanup, chatting with community members who lingered. The sight filled her with a renewed sense of purpose, a confirmation that the path she had chosen was the right one, even if it was difficult. That night, as Marcia drove home, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this community could heal. She knew there would still be challenges, that resistance would persist, but she also knew that change was already taking root, and as long as she had allies within the precinct and supporters in the community, she was confident that they could build something better together. Pushback and progress. As winter settled over the city, Marcia could see her reforms starting to take effect. The precinct statistics were beginning to show a decrease in incidents of excessive force, and more residents were reaching out to share positive feedback. The community's response was a mix of cautious optimism and relief. Finally, someone was listening. But within the walls of the precinct, the mood was far from unanimous support. There were whispers, quiet conversations behind closed doors, and a palpable tension whenever Marcia introduced a new policy. One of the most significant changes Marcia had implemented was the introduction of body cameras for all officers on duty. She believed that transparency was essential to restoring trust, and body cameras were a step toward accountability. However, not everyone was pleased with this addition. Several officers viewed the cameras as an invasion of privacy, a constant reminder that someone was watching their every move. Some even saw it as a lack of trust from Marcia herself, an insinuation that they couldn't be relied upon to do their jobs properly. Officer Stevens, in particular, was vocal about his disapproval. He had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for the officers who opposed Marcia's changes. His influence was subtle but effective. He didn't openly defy her, but his remarks and demeanor sowed seeds of doubt among his colleagues. One afternoon, Marcia held a meeting to address concerns about the body cameras. The room was filled with tension as officers filed in, their faces a mixture of frustration and fatigue. Stevens sat in the back, his arms crossed, a skeptical expression on his face. Marcia began the meeting by reiterating her reasons for implementing the cameras. "The goal here isn't to micromanage you," she said, her tone calm but firm. "It's to protect both you and the citizens we serve. Body cameras are a tool for transparency. They provide an objective account of interactions, which is beneficial for everyone involved." Stevens raised his hand, his voice dripping with skepticism when he spoke. "With all due respect, Chief, it feels like you don't trust us. We've been doing this job for years without cameras, and most of us have served this community with integrity. Why the sudden need for surveillance?" Marcia met his gaze, holding it steady. "It's not about trust, Officer Stevens. It's about accountability. We're living in a time where transparency isn't just expected, it's demanded. I understand that many of you have served this community well, and I respect that. But we've also seen cases where transparency was lacking, and that's led to mistrust. Body cameras aren't about punishing good officers. They're about ensuring that our interactions with the public are fair and just." Stevens scoffed, his voice barely a whisper, but loud enough for others to hear. "Feels like punishment to me." Marcia didn't let his defiance rattle her. She knew Stevens was testing her, trying to undermine her authority in front of the other officers. But she also knew that her response needed to be measured, something that would address his concerns without escalating the tension. "Officer Stevens," she said, her voice steady, "I understand that this is an adjustment, but I'm asking you to look at the bigger picture. We're here to serve the people of this city, and right now, there's a lack of trust between law enforcement and the community. These cameras are a step toward rebuilding that trust. If we do our jobs with integrity, there's nothing to fear." Stevens opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it, his jaw tightening. The room was silent for a moment, a quiet tension hanging in the air as Marcia's words sank in. Slowly, she saw some of the officers nodding, a few even offering her supportive glances. Not everyone was on her side yet, but she could feel the beginning of a shift. She had planted a seed, and though it would take time to grow, she was hopeful that her persistence would pay off. After the meeting, Marcia returned to her office, feeling both exhausted and encouraged. She knew that change was never easy, and Stevens's resistance was a reminder of just how deeply entrenched some of the old attitudes were. But she also knew that she couldn't allow that resistance to derail her mission. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Sergeant Lewis, one of the veterans on the force who had shown quiet but consistent support for her efforts. He was a man of few words, but she appreciated his steady presence and the respect he showed for her authority. The message read, "Just wanted to say that I appreciate what you said in the meeting. Not everyone's going to get on board right away, but you're making a difference. Don't let the pushback get to you." Marcia felt a surge of gratitude, a sense of validation from his words. She typed back a quick response, thanking him for his support, and then set her phone down, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. For every voice of dissent, there were voices like Lewis, people who believed in what she was trying to accomplish. And as long as she had allies within the precinct, she knew she could keep pushing forward. As Marcia's reforms took hold, word spread beyond the precinct, reaching influential voices in the community. Some leaders praised her efforts, while others were skeptical, unsure if her changes were merely symbolic or if they would lead to genuine, lasting impact. One evening, Marcia was invited to speak at a town hall meeting organized by the local community council. The event was packed, with residents from all walks of life filling the small community center. Marcia took the stage, scanning the crowd. She saw familiar faces, people she had grown up with, old friends of her father's, and newer faces who were curious about the new chief who was making waves in their city. She felt a mix of pride and humility as she began to speak. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady and confident. "I know that my presence here as your new chief of police has stirred up a lot of discussion, and I'm here to answer your questions honestly. I understand the concerns that some of you have, and I'm committed to making sure that the changes we're implementing are meaningful, not just surface-level reforms." A hand shot up in the front row, belonging to a middle-aged man with a serious expression. "Chief Wilson, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but how can we be sure these changes will stick? We've seen promises like this before, and nothing ever really changes. How do we know this isn't just another PR stunt?" Marcia met his gaze, her expression earnest. "I understand your skepticism, sir, and I won't pretend that change is easy or that it happens overnight. But I'm not here to offer empty promises. I grew up in this community. I know what it feels like to be on the other side of that badge. That's why I'm committed to holding my officers accountable and making sure our precinct is a place of integrity and respect. But I also need your help. Real change requires all of us to work together." Another hand went up, this time from an older woman with a kind face. "Chief, what about the young people in our community? They're afraid of the police. They see officers as threats, not protectors. How do you plan to bridge that gap?" Marcia nodded thoughtfully. "That's a critical issue, and it's something I'm working on directly. We've started organizing community events where officers can meet with residents outside of enforcement settings, like the barbecue we held a few weeks ago. But I want to go beyond that. We're developing mentorship programs where officers can work with youth, not as enforcers, but as role models. I believe that if young people see us as people who care about their well-being, that fear will begin to fade." The woman smiled, nodding approvingly. Marcia could feel a wave of support building in the room, a quiet sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But not everyone was convinced. Toward the back of the room, a man who had remained silent until now stood up, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression hard. "Chief Wilson, all this talk sounds nice, but I've seen officers in your precinct who treat us like criminals. I've seen my neighbors harassed for nothing. What do you have to say to that?" Marcia's gaze softened, and she stepped down from the stage, moving closer to the man so she could speak directly to him. "Sir, I hear you, and I don't want to dismiss your experiences. There's no excuse for mistreatment, and I'm working to ensure that those behaviors are corrected. But I need you to hold me accountable. If you see officers behaving in ways that go against what we're trying to build, I need you to tell me. This change isn't just coming from the top down. It's a partnership. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to make things right." The man seemed to consider her words, his posture relaxing slightly. He gave a short nod, as if accepting her answer, at least for now. Marcia returned to the stage, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This was what she had fought for: the opportunity to connect with the people she served, to hear their concerns, and to work together toward a better future. As the meeting concluded, several people approached her, offering words of encouragement and support. She noticed Officer Patel in the crowd, his face beaming with pride as he introduced her to his family. She saw Mrs. Johnson, the grandmother of Jamal, who gave her a warm hug and whispered, "Keep going, Chief. We're with you." Marcia left the town hall that night feeling hopeful, but also aware of the long road ahead. She knew that not everyone was on board, and that the resistance she faced was as much a part of her challenge as the reforms themselves. But the voices of support, the faces of those who believed in her mission, they were her fuel, her reason to keep pushing forward. In the days that followed, Marcia continued to balance her time between implementing new policies and building relationships within the community. She attended neighborhood events, met with local leaders, and listened to the concerns of those who felt left behind by the system. Slowly, the walls of mistrust began to crack, giving way to a fragile but growing sense of hope. At the precinct, she noticed small changes too. Officers who had once been skeptical were now more engaged in community meetings, listening instead of dismissing. Reports of unnecessary stops were declining, and she saw fewer complaints crossing her desk. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was progress, tangible, hard-earned progress. One evening, as she sat in her office reflecting on the day, she received an email from a local youth organization. They wanted to partner with the Precinct to create a youth police dialogue program, where young people could speak openly with officers about their experiences and concerns. Marcia felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly the kind of bridge building she had envisioned. She replied immediately, expressing her eagerness to support the program, and made a note to discuss it with her officers the following day. As she prepared to leave for the night, Marcia glanced at the photograph on her desk, a picture of her father, standing tall and proud at a civil rights rally, his face resolute and determined. She felt his presence in that moment, a reminder of the legacy she was carrying forward. With a renewed sense of purpose, Marcia locked up her office and stepped out into the cold night air. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like she was truly making a difference. And she knew that as long as she kept her focus, she could transform the precinct, one step at a time, tested by fire. As spring approached, Marcia's changes in the precinct were finally starting to feel like they were taking root. Crime rates in the area had stabilized, and for the first time in years, there were fewer complaints about police misconduct. Her initiatives, mandatory body cameras, bias training, community dialogues, and outreach programs, were showing results. People in the community were beginning to see her precinct as a place of accountability and respect. And although some officers still grumbled about the new policies, the open hostility had mostly subsided. But Marcia knew better than to relax. She was aware that real, lasting change couldn't be achieved without consistent vigilance. She often thought of her father's words, "The fire of justice burns bright, but you have to keep feeding it or it will die out." She kept those words close to her heart as she navigated the daily challenges of her role. One Thursday evening, just as Marcia was preparing to leave her office, she received a call that would put all her work to the test. "Chief Wilson," said the voice on the other end of the line, her dispatcher sounding tense. "There's been an incident involving one of our officers, Officer Stevens." Marcia's stomach tightened. Officer Stevens had been her most vocal critic since she'd taken over the precinct. He had been resistant to nearly every reform she'd implemented, and she knew he represented a faction of officers who weren't fully committed to her vision. But she also knew that if Stevens had crossed a line, she had to handle it fairly and transparently, regardless of their history. "What happened?" she asked, her voice calm and steady, though her mind was racing. "There was an altercation during a routine traffic stop," the dispatcher explained. "It involved a young black man, unarmed. Things got heated, and Stevens used force. The incident was caught on his body camera." Marcia felt a chill run through her. She had worked so hard to implement policies that would prevent precisely this kind of incident. Now she was facing the first major test of her reforms, and the scrutiny that would come with it. "Send me the footage immediately," Marcia said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She ended the call, sat back in her chair, and took a deep breath. She knew that whatever the video showed, she would have to proceed carefully. The decisions she made in the coming days would either solidify the trust she was building or unravel it entirely. Within minutes, Marcia's computer dinged with an email notification. She opened the file, watching as the screen filled with the image of a dark, empty street captured by Stevens' body camera. The footage began with a routine exchange. Stevens approached the vehicle, asked for identification, and inquired about the driver's destination. The young man in the car, identified as Dinder Williams, appeared calm at first, answering Stevens' questions politely. But as the conversation continued, Marcia noticed Stevens' tone becoming sharper, his questions more accusatory. Dinder, sensing the tension, began to question why he was being pulled over, which seemed to irritate Stevens further. Then, without warning, the situation escalated. Stevens ordered Dinder out of the car, and when Dinder hesitated, Visibly nervous, Stevens pulled him out forcefully. What followed was a brief but intense struggle, with Stevens pinning Diender to the ground, his knee pressing down on the young man's back as he struggled to breathe. Marcia's chest tightened as she watched, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. This was exactly what she had been working to prevent, an abuse of power fueled by prejudice and aggression. As the video ended, she felt a storm of emotions: anger, disappointment, and a deep sadness for Diender, who had been subjected to this treatment for simply driving through his own neighborhood. Marcia knew that she couldn't let this slide. Stevens's actions went against everything she was trying to achieve, and if she didn't address it head-on, it would undermine all the progress she had made. But she also knew that this wouldn't be easy. Disciplining a veteran officer like Stevens would invite backlash, not only from within the precinct, but also from powerful voices in the police union. She sat back, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. She had a choice to make, one that would define her leadership and set a precedent for how her precinct would handle misconduct. With a steadying breath, Marcia reached for her phone and called Sergeant Lewis, her trusted ally. "Sergeant, I need you in my office," she said, her tone leaving no room for delay. "There's something you need to see." When Lewis arrived, Marcia played the footage for him in silence. As he watched, his face grew grim, his jaw tightening with every second. When the video ended, he looked at Marcia, a mixture of anger and resignation in his eyes. "This isn't going to be easy, Chief," he said quietly, echoing her own thoughts. "I know," Marcia replied, her voice firm. "But I didn't take this job to make easy decisions." Stevens crossed a line, and we have a responsibility to hold him accountable. If we let this slide, it sends a message that we're willing to tolerate this kind of behavior. And I won't allow that. Lewis nodded slowly. "I'm with you, Chief, but you know the union will fight this. Stevens has allies, and they'll claim he was just doing his job. They'll try to paint Diender as a threat, say he was resisting." Marcia took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'm prepared for that. But the video speaks for itself. There was no threat. Your actions violated our protocols," Marcia continued, her voice steady. "You used force unnecessarily, and in doing so, you not only harmed a young man but also betrayed the trust we're trying to build with this community. This isn't just about one incident, Officer Stevens. It's about the values we uphold as officers. And what you did goes against everything I'm working to instill in this precinct." Stevens's defiance faltered, replaced by a hint of uncertainty. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but then closed it, realizing that Marcia wasn't going to be swayed. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending further investigation," Marcia said, her tone final. "This decision will stand, regardless of any protests from the union. If they want to challenge it, they can take it up with me." Stevens stared at her, a mixture of shock and disbelief on his face. He hadn't expected her to take such a firm stance, and Marcia could see the realization dawning in his eyes. She wasn't going to back down. After he left, Marcia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her. She knew the backlash would come, but she also knew that she had done the right thing. For too long, officers like Stevens had operated without accountability, protected by a culture that valued loyalty over integrity. But Marcia was here to change that. In the days that followed, Marcia's decision became the subject of intense debate within the precinct and the community. Some officers voiced their support, recognizing the importance of accountability, while others expressed frustration, feeling that Stevens had been unfairly targeted. The police union released a statement criticizing Marcia's decision, calling it heavy-handed and politically motivated. But Marcia stood her ground, meeting each challenge with unwavering resolve. She held press conferences, met with community leaders, and continued her outreach efforts, emphasizing the importance of integrity and transparency. And gradually, she began to see a shift. More and more people reached out, expressing their gratitude for her courage and her commitment to justice. As spring gave way to summer, Marcia's precinct was no longer the place it had once been. It was a place where officers were held accountable, where the community felt heard, and where change, though slow and difficult, was finally taking root. And Marcia, though tested by fire, emerged stronger than ever, ready to keep fighting for the justice and integrity she had promised to uphold. A legacy of change. In the weeks following Officer Stevens' suspension, Marcia found herself at the center of a storm. The backlash was immediate and fierce. The police union organized protests, accusing her of overreach and threatening to take legal action to have Stevens reinstated. Some officers at the precinct gave her cold looks, openly displaying their disapproval. Her decision had shaken up a system that had long protected its own, and now that same system was pushing back hard. But amidst the criticism, there were voices of support. Community leaders, residents, and advocacy groups rallied behind her, praising her commitment to accountability and transparency. Letters poured into her office from people she'd never met, teachers, parents, young people who had grown up fearing the police but now felt a glimmer of hope. One letter, written by a teenage girl, moved Marcia to tears. Chief Wilson, the letter began, written in careful, looping handwriting. My name is Tasha, and I'm 16 years old. I've always been afraid of the police, especially after my older brother was arrested for something he didn't do. But seeing what you did, how you stood up for that young man, made me feel like maybe things can change. Thank you for making me feel like my life matters. Marcia held the letter in her hands, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She knew that every decision she made would have far-reaching consequences, not only for her career, but for people like Tasha who saw her as a symbol of hope. And that was a responsibility she would never take lightly. Despite the support, the pressure continued to build. One evening, as she sat alone in her office, the precinct empty and silent, Marcia's phone rang. It was her mother. "Hey, baby." Her mother's gentle voice filled the room, instantly soothing Marcia's frayed nerves. "How are you holding up?" Marcia leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. "I'm okay, Mom. It's just a lot. Some days I feel like I'm barely holding it all together. The union, the officers who don't want change. It feels like they're all waiting for me to fail." Her mother paused before responding, her voice steady and reassuring. "Marcia, remember why you took this job. Remember all the people who are looking to you, who believe in what you're doing. Change doesn't come easy, especially when you're challenging something as deeply rooted as this. But you have a purpose, and that purpose is stronger than any resistance you're facing." Marcia felt tears prick her eyes. Her mother was right. She had a purpose, and that purpose was bigger than the obstacles in her way. She thanked her mother, ending the call with a renewed sense of resolve. That night, she made a decision. She would hold a public forum, an open meeting where the community and her officers could come together to discuss the changes happening at the precinct. It was a risky move, but Marcia believed in transparency, in facing her challenges head-on. If people had questions, concerns, or even accusations, she would address them openly. The night of the forum arrived, and the community center was packed. Word had spread quickly, and the room was filled with a diverse crowd: residents, activists, community leaders, journalists, and off-duty officers. Marcia could feel the tension in the air as she stepped up to the podium, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She recognized familiar faces: Mrs. Johnson, the grandmother who had shared her grandson's story; Deander Williams, the young man at the center of the recent incident; Officer Patel, who had become one of her most steadfast supporters; and, in the back, Officer Stevens, his arms crossed, watching her with a hard, unreadable expression. Marcia cleared her throat, her voice steadied as she began to speak. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know there are a lot of questions and concerns about the changes happening at this precinct. I'm here to answer those questions, to listen to your concerns, and to work towards solutions together. My goal as chief is to create a precinct that serves everyone with fairness and respect. But I can't do that alone. Real change requires all of us." The first question came from a young man seated near the front. "Chief Wilson, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but do you really think one person can change an entire system? We've been promised reform before, but nothing ever changes. How do we know this is different?" Marcia nodded, acknowledging his skepticism. "That's a fair question, and you're right to ask it. Real change doesn't come from one person. It comes from a collective commitment to do better. I may be leading this precinct, but the change will come from all of us working together. It's not easy, and I don't have all the answers. But I can promise you that as long as I'm here, I will hold myself and my officers accountable to the highest standards." A murmur spread through the crowd as people digested her words. Another hand shot up. This time, a middle-aged man who identified himself as a small business owner in the neighborhood. "Chief, my shop has been broken into 3 times in the past year. We need protection, not just more rules. How do these reforms help us?" Marcia felt the weight of his frustration and nodded. "Thank you for sharing that. Public safety is a priority for me, and part of building trust is ensuring that we're here to protect and serve. These reforms are about making sure that our officers can be both protectors and community members. By building trust, we create an environment where people feel comfortable coming to us for help, and that ultimately makes our neighborhoods safer. We're also increasing patrols in areas with higher crime rates, so you'll start to see more of a police presence there." As the forum continued, Marcia fielded questions and concerns, addressing each one with honesty and empathy. She could feel the crowd's energy shift, the tension gradually giving way to understanding. People began to see her as not just a figure of authority, but as someone who truly cared about their needs and was willing to listen. Then, just as the evening was winding down, a voice called out from the back. It was Officer Stevens. "Chief Wilson," he began, his voice challenging, but with a hint of genuine curiosity. "Do you really think these changes make us safer? Do you think it's fair to ask us to change the way we've done things for years, especially when we're out there risking our lives every day?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Marcia. This was the question she'd known would come, the question that went to the heart of the resistance she'd been facing. She took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she looked at Stevens. "Yes, Officer Stevens, I do believe these changes make us safer. Safer for the community and safer for us. Accountability and respect are not just principles. They're practices that protect everyone involved. I understand that this is a shift, and I respect the risks that all of you take every day. But I also know that we have a responsibility to do our jobs in a way that honors the trust people place in us. If that means changing the way we approach certain situations, then that's a change worth making." Stevens held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't a gesture of full agreement, but it was a start. Marcia felt a surge of hope. Perhaps even those most resistant could come to see the value in her vision. As the forum concluded, Marcia mingled with the crowd, listening to feedback and offering thanks to those who had shown up. She saw Diender approach her, a quiet smile on his face. "Chief Wilson," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for everything." Marcia shook his hand, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. "Thank you, Diender. Your courage in sharing your story helped make all of this possible. I'm grateful." As Diender walked away, Marcia felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Sergeant Lewis, his face beaming with pride. "You did good, Chief," he said, nodding approvingly. "I think tonight was exactly what people needed to see." Marcia smiled, feeling the weight of the evening's events settle over her. It hadn't been easy, but she knew that moments like these were the foundation of real change. And though there was still much work to be done, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that every step, every decision, was part of a larger journey. Over the following months, Marcia's reforms continued to shape the precinct. Officers who had once resisted her changes began to adapt, finding that the new practices actually made their work easier and safer. Complaints about misconduct dropped significantly, and community engagement increased. More young people, inspired by Marcia's leadership, reached out to the precinct, interested in learning about careers in law enforcement. The police union eventually backed down, unable to muster the public support they'd hoped for. Marcia's reputation as a fair, compassionate, and unyielding leader had won over the community, and even some of her harshest critics within the precinct had come to respect her resolve. One evening, as Marcia prepared to leave the precinct, she saw a familiar figure waiting outside, Officer Stevens. She approached him cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "Chief Wilson," he said, his tone more respectful than she'd ever heard it. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong. About you, about the changes. I see now that you were right. We needed this. I needed this. And I'm grateful." Marcia felt a surge of emotion, and she extended her hand. "Thank you, Officer Stevens. Change is hard, but I'm glad we're on the same team." They shook hands, a gesture that felt symbolic, a bridge between the past and the future, a recognition of the journey they had taken together. As Marcia walked to her car that night, she felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had taken on this role with a vision of change, and though the road had been filled with obstacles, she had stayed true to her mission. She had created a precinct that was a force for good, a place where integrity, accountability, and respect were not just words but lived values. And as she drove home, the city lights stretching out before her, Marcia knew that her work was far from over. But for the first time, she felt that she wasn't just fighting against a broken system. She was building something new, a legacy of justice, hope, and resilience that would continue long after she was gone.